In the previous lecture, we discussed how important the medieval world was for Lewis, as well as how he painstakingly kept track of old words and their subtle shifts in meaning, how he studied old Latin books, which had been left neglected and untranslated, in order to understand medieval poems written in English, French, and Italian dialects we no longer understand. But why exactly did he work so hard to see through these eyes? Why did he long so much to recover the old way of seeing? What were the Middle Ages, and why were they so important for Lewis? In the popular imagination, as Lewis joked more than once, the Middle Ages is a misty blend of knights, castles, witch trials, torture, armor, superstitious peasants, and maybe a dragon and a princess thrown in to boot. In contrast to the popular imagination, though, Lewis points out that the medieval period was not an age of primitive superstition, but bookish sophistication. Characteristically, says Lewis, medieval man was not a dreamer nor a spiritual adventurer. He was an organizer, a codifier, a man of system. His ideal could not be unfairly summed up: a place for everything and everything in its right place. Three things are typical of him. First, that small minority of his cathedrals in which the design of the architect was actually achieved. I'm thinking of a thing like Salisbury. Secondly, the Summa of Thomas Aquinas. And thirdly, the Divine Comedy of Dante. In all these alike, we see the tranquil, indefatigable, exultant energy of a passionately logical mind, an ordering of a huge mass of heterogeneous details into unity. They desire unity and proportion, all the classical virtues, just as keenly as the Greeks did, but they have a greater and more varied collection of things to fit in." End quote. In this way, they're closer to us than the world of primitive religion. But nevertheless, Lewis thought that we moderns are separated by the pre-modern world by what he called a great divide, a kind of gigantic cultural chasm that separates us from our pre-modern ancestors. In other words, our vision and expectations of the world, our background assumptions, our ideas of what human flourishing mean, have fundamentally shifted. And it's not just that they believe some things that we don't, like the earth is at the center of the universe, or man's psychological powers are in tune with the powers of the cosmos. Rather, there was also a qualitative change that accompanied these points of fact, so that our whole background picture has changed. That is, just as Christians and non-Christians alike today will talk about light speed or inferiority complexes or the 1%, without necessarily being advocates of Einstein, Freud, or Marx, so too did medieval Christians and ancient pagans share a number of general background beliefs that made them, quote, far more like each other than either was like a modern man, end quote. For this reason, Lewis thought an ancient Roman had more in common with someone from the 17th century than either of them do with us, because, he explains, the old model still underlies their work. It was not totally and confidently abandoned till the end of the 17th century. In the remainder of this talk, I would like to provide three medieval snapshots. Texts Lewis knew, analyzed, and used as examples of the medieval way of seeing in his discarded image, and then show how Lewis used these facts, so to speak, to provide a vision along the beam. By the end of this lecture, I hope the difference between the medieval way of viewing the world and the modern way will be clear. That is, why Lewis claimed that a Roman pagan had more in common with a medieval Christian, a separation of 1,000 years, than his age did with someone who had lived just 100 years before. My first example is drawn from the ancient Roman statesman and author Cicero. We read him today, if we read him, as the great example of Republican Roman politics, the orator who defended the Republic from tyranny by means of the elegant word. But in the Middle Ages, Cicero's fame was due to a short visionary account called The Dream of Scipio, in which he described a Roman general's vision. This 10-page visionary account was the concluding chapter to Cicero's Republic, but it was copied independently of the rest of the text, in part because a writer in late antiquity, Macrobius, wrote a 300-page commentary to it. Macrobius was convinced that every word in Cicero's visionary account had a deep mystical significance, and this conditioned the next 1,000 years of reading of Cicero's Dream of Scipio in hushed, reverent tones. as if within these pages the deep mysteries of the universe were revealed to those who had eyes to see. In any case, Cicero's imaginative account of Scipio, he flies up through the spheres of the heavens and comes to stand at the apex of the universe. Once there, Scipio meets his male ancestors, uncles and grandfathers, who teach him about all the Roman virtues, honor, justice, duty, and then they make him turn around to contemplate the universe stretched out beneath his feet. At one particularly dramatic moment, Scipio looks down and sees the universe stretched out beneath him. And then after hearing an incredible music, he asks, "What is this sound, so loud and yet so sweet, that fills my ears?" His guide answers, "That's the sound produced by the impetus and momentum of the spheres themselves. It's made up of intervals which, though unequal, are determined systematically by fixed proportions. The blend of high and low notes produces our even flow of various harmonies. By imitating this system with strings and voices, experts have succeeded in opening a way back to this place. Filled with this sound, people's ears have become deaf to it." In other words, the planets are spaced out proportionally to one another, so the distance between, say, Earth and Mars and Venus and Jupiter correspond to musical chords. And as these planets rotate, they create a kind of intellectual music to which we have become deaf. But we can regain the ability to hear this music through study or through beautiful music, which imitate the same harmonic proportions which space out the heavenly bodies. This idea of a musical universe whose planets are spaced out like strings on a musical instrument delighted the imagination of the medieval period. Boethius, to take one example, borrowed the idea from Cicero. In a passage from his Consolation of Philosophy, a sort of medieval New York Times bestseller, Boethius too imagined himself high above our universe, viewing the cosmos stretched out beneath his feet. In one particularly beautiful poem from his Consolation, you can hear the author's excitement and delight as he describes the choreographed movements of the universe. "Star maker, master of spheres, at whose command the heavens spin and the constellations dance, that you on your steady throne have choreographed. Bright stars grow dim as you bring on the moon, crescent or gibbous, reflecting her brother's dazzling fire. When leaves fall and the cold of winter blows from the north, our days diminish. But then in summer's burgeoning heat, the dark hours of nighttime dwindle. Not even the blowing winds are random, but Boreas strips leaves from the trees and Zephyrus brings on gentling nurture." Not even the blowing winds are random, says Boethius rhapsodically. In other words, Boethius looks at the earth turning, and in his mind's eye he sees the seasons springing up and falling away, the heavens rotating, and the celestial movements stirring up terrestrial winds. This is what Boethius, in another lesser-known work, De Musica, called the music of the cosmos. For Boethius, there was a kind of rational order that kept the world in balance, keeping it from spinning out of control. It made sure that the elements of different kinds bonded properly to one another. It regulated how the seasons cycled in an ongoing carousel. This order also regulated how the stars and planets turned. And this cosmic order he called music, because it was a deep mathematical harmony that framed out the world into understandable patterns. What's more, Boethius even taught through instrumental music we can regain a picture of the musicality of the world and thus retune our souls to cosmic music. Music is philosophical therapy, bringing the soul back into tune with the great conductor's universe. And this is why he has his own short little book, Alternate Between Prose and Verse. Before turning back to Lewis, let me mention the thought of one more author that the Oxford Don wrote about in Discarded Image, Chalcidius. We don't know much about this author, who was writing at some point in late antiquity, but he wrote an extremely successful commentary on Plato's Timaeus, the only work of Plato to be read throughout the medieval period. To be perfectly truthful, Chalcidius' commentary is a bit tedious, because the late antique author goes passage by passage, dividing up Plato's text up into blocks, taking the occasion to provide what he thought would be the necessary background for each subject. And thus, Chalcidius, who never says no to a digression, provides innumerable little manualistic introductions to any field of medieval science you could hope to come to know. He was so digressive that 500 pages after he started, he'd only made it halfway through the Platonic text he wished to comment on. But what is a bizarre and tiresome book for us was a treasure for medieval students and scholars. As for Cicero and Boethius, Chalcidius taught that the heavens are quite literally a symphony. Quote, "The Pythagorean doctrine is that the world consists of harmonic ratio, and that the celestial bodies, separated by intervals which are congruent and consonant with one another, produce musical sounds owing to the extremely rapid impulse of their flight. Musical sounds are produced by stellar movement." End quote. The whole world is attuned, quote, "as with the 7 tones of a plucked cithara." End quote. All of these orchestrated motions exist because they constitute the best possible way to make manifest the perfection of eternity. Chalcidius. Such then is the constitution of the world in its entirety, consisting of bodies and material elements which are complete in themselves, directed by the rudder of providence to form a form of movement suited to eternity. End quote. Thus, the universe is a kind of text which inspires contemplation of the deep patterns built in by the craftsman. Thus, when Chalcidius looked up at the heavens, he looked with admiration and longing. It was a perfect unchanging symphony. The stars are, quote, "borne round in a unified and constant movement, adhering to the largest sphere which embraces all things, as it leads them round, always maintaining one and the same position and preserving their order in an unvarying pattern, never admitting any change in position, ascent, size, or even color." End quote. In contrast, our world, that is the world of matter and water and air, everything below the moon, is one, Chalcidius says, of birth and decay, and, quote, "increase and diminution, every kind of transformation and transposition from place to place, where murder, violence, and madness dwell." End quote. Man then was on the outside looking in. As Lewis so poignantly summed it up, quote, "We watch the spectacle of the celestial dance from its outskirts. Our highest privilege is to imitate it in such measure as we can. The medieval model is, if we may use the word, anthropo-peripheral. We are creatures of the margin. To the extent we get a glimpse of the eternal festival, out there, we are happy." In any case, over his lengthy commentary, Chalcidius builds up a picture of the world in his reader's mind. The movements of stars and planets, the interaction of elements, the whole moving picture of the world. But then he analyzes these movements for their underlying patterns, the deep music or mathematical harmony that rules the world. For Chalcidius, then, you could say mathematics is more real than the visible, because it's the rational design which everything else is merely a physical expression of. By building up this world in our mind, and then by discovering the mathematical skeleton beneath the world's skin, we can get at the real world, the deep world. About 2 centuries earlier, the philosopher Plotinus had taught something similar, and it gives us a fascinating picture of how the medieval scholar felt an invisible world of delight and order to be sleeping just beneath the visible world. Plotinus says, quote, "Let us then make a mental picture of our universe. Each member shall remain what it is, distinctly apart, yet all is to form, as far as possible, a complete unity, so that whatever comes into view, say the outer orb of the heavens, shall bring immediately with it the vision, on the one plane, of the sun and of all the stars, with earth and sea and all living things, as if exhibited upon a transparent globe. Bring this visually actually before your sight, so that there shall be in your mind the gleaming representation of a sphere, a picture holding all the things of the universe moving, or in response, or in reality, some at rest, some in motion. Keep this sphere before you, and from it imagine another, a sphere stripped of magnitude and of spatial differences. Cast out your inborn sense of matter, taking care not merely to attenuate it. Call on God, maker of the sphere whose image you now hold, and pray him to enter. And may he come bringing his own universe with all the gods that dwell in it. He who is the one God and all the gods, where each is all blending into a unity, distinct in powers, but all one God in virtue of that one divine power of many facets." This type of pagan reverence for the world leads medieval authors to some of the most bizarre, by our standards, moments of reverent worship of geometry or numbers, such as Chalcidius' encomium of the triangle. Quote, "No shape is more suitable than this one, in which the unity placed at the top is seen to hold the place of the summit or pinnacle, so that through it, as a kind of conduit, so to speak, a certain bountiful river, as it were, might flow as if from the depths of the perennial fount of provident intelligence, and the unity itself to be understood to be mind intelligence, or the craftsman God himself." End quote. Elsewhere, Chalcidius devotes lengthy praise to the number 7, because it's like Athena, neither generated nor generating any number from 1 to 10. Even more difficult for us to conceive is that the ordered political society could be based on the patterns of the cosmos. For instance, just as, quote, "the stellar powers command, the angelic beings execute, and the terrestrials obey," end quote, so it is that the highest parts are those philosophical rulers who command. After them comes the warrior caste, which carries out their orders. Finally, the common people obey, end quote. The political order, understood as a descending hierarchy from the king to the knights to the commoners, was based on cosmic order. As you can see, the medieval cosmos felt different than it does in our modern imaginary. The world was not just orderly, but directed and intentional, and all of the different sciences, for this reason, overlapped. We don't believe, for example, that listening to Bach will help us come to know anything about astrophysics. And we don't believe that music theory could help the structural engineer. But the medieval mind saw a deep harmony between all these sciences. Cathedrals were like temples of built music, and music was like liquefied architecture. If a medieval church turned out to have a remarkably good acoustics for chant, the medieval mind would not have been surprised. Of course it would. Both the church and the melody follow the same harmonic principles, and both of them imitate patterns found in the stars. But perhaps even more surprisingly, following such Pythagorean harmonics ensures as well the very stability of the building, just as listening to the right kind of music actually can restore health to the soul because it restores you in the order of the world. Doing astronomy, then, could be a form of psychological therapy. In sharp contrast, we obviously believe each of these disciplines, music theory, astrophysics, psychology, medicine, and creative writing, traveled their own paths and had nothing to say to one another, except for some occasional overlap where the boundaries of the disciplines meet. In contrast, for Chalcidius, if you cultivate a deep perception of the deep harmony of reality, it leads to worship. The vision of rational pattern of the world lifts up the soul because, quote, "the soul, fashioned after the same pattern as the celestial bodies, immediately recognizes its own natural affinity to them," end quote. So far we've talked about this sense of order and harmony, which regulated every aspect of life: physics, engineering, ethics, music, politics, psychology. But there's one other fascinating difference, that is, to the medieval cosmos. It was felt to be vitally alive, a kind of great living being. The world moves because it experiences desire. Planets race around because they're moved by intelligences. Whereas for us, the heavens are places, says Lewis, quoting Pascal, of cold, eternal silences. For the medievals, the heavens were warm and happy. Here's how Lewis summed it up, quote, "The fundamental concept of modern science is, or was till very recently, that of natural laws. In medieval science, the fundamental concept was that of certain sympathies, antipathies, and strivings inherent in matter itself. Modern man speaks about a falling rock as obeying a law of nature. Medieval man spoke of the rocks as desiring, longing to return to its natural place, like a pigeon flying home to its nest by a homing instinct. Pre-modern metaphors were animated. The cosmos, in a certain sense, seemed saturated with presence and soul. It was densely alive, and thus it exerted a kind of moral current, pulling your soul along with your mind. In contrast, modern man prefers inorganic metaphors that describe the steady, unwavering movement of machines. Thus, when Lewis was writing about the Renaissance, he called it a period of, quote, new learning and new ignorance. That is, the recovery of ancient documents overlapped with new scientific discoveries, but such new learning put the old image of the cosmos to rest, bringing with it an insensitivity to the vitality of the world. Again, medieval man thought of the universe as an orchestra, quote, tingling with anthropomorphic life, dancing, ceremonial, a festival, not a machine. It's very important to grasp this at the outset. If we do not, says Lewis, we shall constantly misread our poets by taking for a highly conceited metaphor expressions which are still hardly metaphorical at all. End quote. For us, the term Mother Earth is a metaphor. For the medievals, they describe the earth this way, quote, is she not a huge animal breathing out through the craters of mountains as if through mouths and nostrils? End quote. For Lewis, this is not just an arbitrary issue of two different metaphors. But as he insisted throughout his life, metaphors make a great difference to the tone of your mind. It matters, quote, whether you fill your universe with phantom police courts and traffic regulations, or with phantom longings and endeavors, end quote. And some, putting it all together, I'd like to quote one of Lewis's best efforts to get at the difference between a pre-modern and modern cosmic imaginary. Here's his attempt to create what it felt like to look with medieval eyes. Go out on a starry night and walk alone for half an hour, resolutely assuming that the pre-Copernican astronomy is true. Look up at the sky with the assumption in your mind. The real difference between living in that universe and living in ours will then, I predict, begin to dawn on you. He goes on. You'll be looking at a world unimaginatively large, but quite definitely finite. At no speed possible to man, and no lifetime possible to man, could you ever reach its frontier. But the frontier is there, hard, clear, sudden as a national frontier. And secondly, because the earth is an absolute center, and earthwards from any part of this immense universe is downwards, you will find that you are looking at the planets and stars in terms not merely of distance, but a very special kind of distance which we call height. Now, these two factors taken together, enormous but finite size, and distance, which, however vast, remain unambiguously vertical and indeed vertiginous, at once present you with something which differs from the Newtonian picture, rather as a great building differs from a great jungle. You can lose yourself in infinity. There's indeed nothing much else you can do with it. It arouses questions. It prompts to a certain kind of wonder and reverie, usually a somber kind, but it answers no questions. The old universe was wholly different in its effect. It was an answer, not a question. It offered not a field for musing, but a single overwhelming object, an object which at once abashes and exalts the mind. We'll talk more about the ethical consequences of the disappearance of the model in the next lecture. But for now, note that Lewis thought this was of more than historical interest. By gutting the cosmos, he was afraid, we might also gut what it means to be human, hollow out man, make him empty, and thus precipitate a kind of apocalypse of humanity. We're in danger of becoming, in Lewis's poignant phrase, men without chests. When we discard the old animate, ceremonial, and orchestral image of the cosmos, our language becomes littered with dead metaphors. When the deep meaning has departed, words become like the dead, dry husks left behind by molting cicadas. And Lewis loved to represent this modern deadness to the cosmos. He invented a number of comic fictional characters who embodied this coldness, such as Uncle Andrew, who witnesses the making of Narnia and can only speculate on how profitable it could be. Or to take another example, when King Caspian in Voyage of the Dawn Treader appears before Governor Gumpus, the young idealistic king rebukes the tired bureaucratic administrator for allowing the slave trade to exist on the island. The governor replies, "An essential part of the economic development of the islands, I assure you. Our present burst of prosperity depends on it. Your Majesty's tender years hardly make it possible that you should understand the economic problem involved. I have statistics, I have graphs, And Caspian interrupts. Tender as my years may be, I understand the slave trade from within quite as well as your sufficiency, and I do not see that it brings into the islands meat, or bread, or beer, or wine, or timber, or cabbages, or books, or instruments of music, or horses, or armor, or anything else worth having. But whether or not it does or not, it must be stopped." "But that would be putting the clock back," gasped the governor. "Have you no idea of progress or development?" Note that Gambas's speech is littered with abstractions. He feels some bizarre but vague loyalty to diluted terms, like development and economic necessity. Such hazy bureaucratic talk seems full of imperative urgency, but has no power to evoke and create love for real concrete things. Gambas is a modern. In sum, Lewis believed that the modern world, with its mechanical view of the cosmos, its belief that deep meaning lies within, and its complacent use of desiccated language, is an environment in which the good does not feel substantial, a world in which there is no positive desire and longing. In the next lecture, we'll explore some of the ethical and pedagogical consequences of this.